Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
And welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray. And I'm happy to introduce you today to Mary Mueller Shutan. Mary is an author and spiritual teacher who's spent the last 15 years studying and practicing holistic medicine, energy work, body work, meditation, occult and magical practices, and spiritual healing. She holds a master's degree in Chinese medicine and has certifications in craniosacral therapy, zero balancing, biodynamic craniosacral therapy, Usi Reiki Roho, Karuna Reiki massage therapy, and Asian bodywork therapy. Mary combines her extensive education with her personal meditative practices and direct revelation of the spirit world. She's the author of The Spiritual Awakening Guide, Managing Psychic Abilities, The Body Diva, Working with Kundalini, The Shamanic Workbook 1, and The Complete Chord Course. And you can learn more about her work at maryshutan.com. So, Mary, welcome to Bespoken Bones.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I wanted to start with something that I read that you wrote. You said, people are simply a sum of their wounds and can only be expected to act differently when they are more conscious and whole. Would you be willing to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, the way that I work, the way that I walk my spiritual path now is very much of an understanding of what is inner is outer. And so the simple way to talk about that is that, if somebody really upsets me or triggers me, is that, I kind of take that and look at within at what is creating that reaction within me. So one of the things that I've noticed through doing work like this over the years is that I was getting upset at people, and they either simply didn't know better or I didn't know better because of where I was in my path. And that you really can't expect people to have clarity or presence of mind or, any of those things that we sometimes logic, any of those things that we sometimes expect of people, because they have a very vested interest in keeping their beliefs the way that they are, keeping their experiences of the world the way they are, because they are what they know. They are how they have chosen to, kind of survive in this world. A lot of times we're kind of, I hate to use the word programmed, but we come into being in this world in our early childhood experiences and all these experiences that kind of inform our existence, everything from ancestral healing to, kind of the location and period of time in which we were born. They all sort of inform us and create who we are as people. And until somebody really decides to look at that or to look at elements of what is not working in their lives, you can't expect people to think differently or act differently or anything like that.
It seems like with that approach, one saves oneself some suffering, right? You're saying, it's about me managing my expectations rather than projecting on you something, expecting you to be different than you've proven yourself to be, yeah?
Yeah, it very much diminishes suffering, and it also allows for you the opportunity to really look at why you are reacting to people and to let go of kind of layers and layers of control over people, because I interact with people all the time as a spiritual teacher that I'd love to, be like, this is a huge blockage in your life. You need to look at it. But I can only do that for certain of my students who are ready to hear things like that. The rest of them, may not be, or may not be for certain, in regards to certain blind spots, so to speak. So I look at it more as a letting go of control, and really I teach my students to use kind of the concept of a door and see in a person how wide or how small or how closed that door may be in them, because that's kind of the space that they're giving you to reconsider their beliefs, reconsider their way of being in this world. Because if you try to force that door open, it just doesn't work out well. They're going to, not react well. They're not going to listen to you anyway.
It's such the antithesis, I think, of what I see happening in the world, like on social media, where, there's all this outward projection of my discomfort, my pain is about your behavior, right? And you're saying, oh, like those are moments of great teaching where I can look at those, the ways that I am triggered, and I can own them. I can work with them for the sake of my own healing.
Exactly. And what happens is that you begin to really understand that the aspect of you that is reacting is often not your current adult self. It's you as a teenager, or ancestral wounds, or, cultural, or, personal from childhood or something like that. And so in the book, I talk a little bit about both kind of looking at your reactivity in situations and really sitting with how much of this reactivity is appropriate for the situation, and how much of it, is it 5 times what it should be? Is it 25 times? Is it 50 times? And really looking at how you react and what age you would put that as, because what happens is that you start to see yourself react, and you start to kind of tally up these experiences where you realize that you're reacting like a 5-year-old throwing a temper tantrum every time somebody who is like this comes into your world. And so you can then do that healing of looking at that 5-year-old and healing the source of things. And what happens is that you stop being reactive or looking to control or even change that person that 5-year-old was once reactive to. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. Yeah, I was speaking with my partner recently, and I was having a temper tantrum, really, of like, why do I always have to be the skillful one? And not about him, just about other stuff. And he was like, well, yeah, Pavini, but you're skillful for you, right? You do this work for you so that you don't have to suffer like that. And I think that that's what I hear you saying, is that like doing the work around reactivity, it's not about, that's really what it's about, is about like making your life more easeful.
It is, yeah. I mean, again, if we kind of go back to the social media thing, just because it's so easy to point out, is like, if you look at kind of the noise and chaos that's on there, it's quite easy to see. It's like, people kind of distracting themselves, and creating a lot of stuff to distract themselves. But it's really that taking responsibility for self and like really looking at, why do I engage in behaviors like this? Are they even working for me in my life? That sort of thing.
Yeah, like we get to feel good in our lives. Like we can make that choice. And I want to distinguish here, because I don't think you're saying that the bigger things, that there's not things worth feeling outrage about, right? That there are things that are worth fighting, for sure. And like, if I'm having feelings about an ism or a phobia, or something, some kind of oppression that's being enacted, like that's not me being reactive necessarily. But if I'm outraged at how someone is treating me personally, that is more. Am I getting it?
Yeah, I mean, I might rephrase that in a different way. What I would say is that there is a purpose for our emotions, and I truly believe that while we're in the human form, that we're intended to feel all of our emotions. Our emotions are very much linked to our passion. They're very much linked to our vitality. If we don't experience the full range of emotions, and that includes anger as well as, joy and kind of everything in between, we really in some way are not being vital, whole, healthy human beings. So we very much should be outraged at certain things going on in this world. If somebody, almost gets us into a car accident or does get us involved in a car accident, we have every right to feel angry at them. But what happens is that we live in a world, in a society where we are so distanced and have been told that our emotions are wrong and bad so many times that we don't have emotional intelligence. We don't know what our emotions are vital messengers, and we don't know what they're saying anymore. And so what happens is that we get all of this trauma sort of stockpiled personally and collectively. And so when we're reacting to a situation, let's say somebody almost gets you into a car accident, okay, you get angry, you're angry for the next 2 hours or something like that. But really over that, after that, you shouldn't be thinking about that person in anger like 6 months later or something like that, or be angry or in a state of rage that's 50 times what the situation sort of warrants. So I do get that there's kind of a divide of, even that word appropriate, but it's really, if you start to really look and question what emotions are coming up and kind of the force of if they're coming up and if they're coming up for a reason versus if they're coming up due to prior traumas, that can offer a lot of clarity to people, I feel.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for smoothing out what I was ungracefully trying to say. I appreciate that. I want to ask you about embodiment and why embodiment? Like, obviously, you're talking about the emotions and the life that they live in the body, right? But it's a hard sell sometimes, right? So just curious of what you'd say to why is embodiment important?
Well, it's one of those things that if you look out at the world, especially if you look out at spiritual communities, it's understandable. I mean, our lives have a lot of struggle. We experience, a lot of pain in the human form. And so these ideas are really appealing that we can ascend somewhere, that we can, not feel that we can somehow be above, being human and, having a deteriorating body or a body that doesn't function well. What has happened in terms of my own awareness and because of the path that I've gone down and some of the systems and things that I've worked with is that I believe that embodiment, that enlightenment comes through the human form. It's clear light flowing through the body. And so it's a question of if we want to become more conscious, more whole, discover deeper truth, whatever we're kind of looking for on the spiritual path, is that it really must include the physical body. And so I talk about this in the book, but I really think, and this is more of kind of, okay, I won't go there, but what I would say is that it's my belief system that we are consciousness, and that includes our human form. And so while in human bodies, we have the opportunity to transform ourselves in the widest range of consciousness on, kind of a continuum from the most dense aspects of ourselves, which is the human form, through the least dense aspects of ourselves, which would be the spiritual energies of our bodies. So I don't view the physical body and our spiritual nature as like these separate things or these separate containers. I view them as a continuum. And so if you heal yourself through embodiment practices or do magic through embodiment or dance or whatever, whatever your kind of thing is, if you include the physical form, it results in so much transformation, so much evolution that just simply doesn't happen without the physical form.
It's the site of the change.
It is, yeah.
Thank you. I want to dive in with you today, talking in particular about trauma. And I know that it's something that you have written a lot about and thought a lot about and studied and do a lot of work with. And talking about it, how trauma can really create that liminal space, you've written about it as that it can give us certain psychic capacities, sensitivities, changes in perception. Would just love to really hear your take on both the mechanics of it as well as the blessings of it.
So, I mean, if we're talking about paths to awakening, trauma certainly is one of them. And what I would say about it is that trauma kind of creates psychic openings or, kind of cracks that allow for us to view our lives in a different capacity. And so, for example, the simplest way to talk about it is that if you go through the experience of a parental death, for example, for a period of time, you're going to kind of be in that liminal space where you're no longer concerned about, taking the trash out every Wednesday, or, like your hair not looking nice, or kind of whatever. I don't mean to diminish the daily concerns, but what I'm saying is that you kind of go to that deeper perspective because you're in that sort of liminal space. You're in that area of concern where you're taken away a bit from the daily noise, from your typical concerns. And so in my Managing Psychic Abilities book, I did a bunch of research as well as talked to a lot of people that I would gauge in that 20% of the population that's considered anywhere from highly sensitive to highly psychic. And those who are in the moderately to highly psychic category always had two concurring things, and one of them was severe early childhood trauma, and the other was ancestral or genetic capacities. But what happens with trauma is that it really does create these breaks in our systems in which we are able to look at the world differently through different perception. For example, I've done a lot of magical ritual, and that's kind of a sort of induced trauma, so to speak, some of them that are more hardcore. And it is because it does allow this different perspective. The difficulty with it is that a clear perspective? Is that a perspective in which somebody is hypersensitive due to trauma, in which they are seeing the world and the people in it as scary things that might attack them, or creating myths about the spiritual realms that they're after them, or whatever is going on with them that has resulted from biological or survival mechanisms that are enacted when we experience trauma, versus kind of clear perspective. And so to get from a place of trauma being something that occurred that is causing a psychic break that may result in a lack of functioning and hypersensitivity, to a place of expanded awareness, basically requires a lot of healing. It requires a lot of clarity about what has happened. And it's through that kind of idea of that pathway of suffering, really allowing for somebody to expand, really allowing for somebody to be more compassionate towards others in a way that wouldn't happen if that trauma hadn't occurred.
There's this question that I ask sometimes in my work with clients, and it's one of those ones that really requires the absolute right moment for it, because if it's too soon or too late, it doesn't work. But the question is, do you wish this hadn't happened to you? And I think this is what you're saying, is if we've done enough healing work, we get to the point where we say, well, I kind of wish that hadn't happened to me, but I wouldn't give up the things that I've gotten because of having had that happen to me. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, that can be a perspective that is had through trauma. What I would say is that you can get to a point with trauma with recognizing what has happened and recognizing how it has changed you, and to a point of kind of neutrality about it. What happens when we experience trauma is like an aspect of ourselves splits off or is sort of sectioned off, and we have so much energy that's locked into this traumatized aspect of self. If we experience a severe trauma, let's say at 6, we kind of have this, this 6-year-old within us that's continually sort of looping through, continually sort of experiencing that trauma. What I'm saying is that trauma does allow for an expanded perspective. It can allow for greater consciousness or the ability to see things in a different way. It requires a lot of healing and kind of stepping into the adult self instead of continually going into like what that 6-year-old, is feeling and their beliefs and that sort of stuff. Does that make sense?
It does. So you're really discerning between, what I hear you saying is that you're discerning between unintegrated trauma and integrated trauma.
Yeah, that's a simple way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. That we do
on a little.
We get that. Well, we can harvest the blessings if we're willing to put in the work around owning our triggers, owning our reactivity, working with ourselves, working with our survival responses, working with our somatic animal bodies to be with, right? And to make space for everything that happens so that we can have we can really utilize the gifts and the capacities that are, and the sensitivities that we get without, right, being in our 6-year-olds temper tantrum selves all the time.
Yeah, and really what happens, as we heal more and more, as we do become more integrated, that allows for us to have clearer perspective, but it also allows for us to be able to like kind of, meet the world and the people in it, a bit better. So when we're in a traumatized state, that's always a state of disconnection. That's always a state of, a lot of belief systems. And I talk about this in the Body Diva book, is that when we experience trauma, we create, myths about ourselves. We create a lot of beliefs out of that situation, and we kind of continually live out that trauma, continually live out those beliefs until we sort of examine them. So it is that process of integration of kind of taking all those separated aspects of self and being like, hey, one of the lines I always ask people during sessions is, it's really exhausting to be disconnected, to be isolated, to have like an inner 6-year-old that feels like the world is on her shoulders and that everybody hates her, or, whatever's going on. And so that's typically the sort of awakening that can allow for people to be like, oh yeah, I would rather be, 35 or 55 or, my current adult self sort of thing. Right.
And if we want to be fully in our power, all of those pieces, they're weak links in the fence, right? Or we need to go back and strengthen, bolster, clean house, cut the cords. Like those are things that you talk about, so that we can really be in the fullness of our sovereignty.
Yeah, and a big part of that, another word I would use, is acceptance. And so the way that I approach the body, or in the book I talk about, I devote a chapter to resistance. And we can even approach even, kind of the atavistic, animalistic aspects of ourselves, the violent aspects of ourselves, even the greatest resistance with ourselves, with compassion and with an understanding that they have a right to be, they have a voice, they have a story to tell, they have a reason for being. And what we try to do with something like resistance is through sheer force of will, sort of get ourselves past it. And if we look at, for example, New Year's resolutions are coming up, the reason why people fail is because they're trying to like steamroll over a boulder of resistance, and eventually they're going to get tired. Or looking at it in a different perspective, their resistance has a reason for being there, and it's through listening, through acceptance, that some of the even most difficult emotions, or even things like the most brutal of resistance, we can really heal and integrate them.
When we were talking about embodiment, and I think this is exactly what you're saying, is that the resistance that we have has a function and a purpose, right? It's not just that we're being difficult or we're being lazy or whatever. Like there's something important that it's taking care of. And so we were talking about embodiment and kind of how I hold that as a somatic awareness, a somatic wisdom. And you use the term Body Diva. And I want to read about a case that you wrote about, but I would just like to have you speak briefly to how you're using that term Body Diva, because it appears a few times in the text, yeah?
Yeah, and so the traditional correlation with Deva is deity, but really it can be looked at as kind of in an animistic sense, as consciousness, as intelligence. So we're speaking to the intelligence of the body, the consciousness of the body.
Yeah, cool. That's what I thought. All right. So is it okay if I read this this case study of Stephen?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Awesome. Okay. So this is from Mary's book, The Body Diva, Working with the Spiritual Consciousness of the Body. And it's from the Healing Family and Ancestry chapter. Stephen found himself consistently enraged by what he described as minor inconveniences. He would emerge from his rage embarrassed and unsure about why he got so upset at traffic, friends, or work colleagues. When he worked with his percentages, he found that 10% of this rage was appropriate and 90% was not. He came from a loving middle-class home. His parents were always available to him, encouraged him in football and orchestra, supported him financially as much as they were able to during college. He reported having an older brother who he got along with reasonably well and no particular early childhood trauma. When we asked his body, Deva, to show him where this rage was coming from, it showed his genitals, pelvis, and left leg. The pattern felt dense and cold, and Stephen said he felt like running, and his body shook when we started looking at it. We asked the body Deva as well as the individual pattern, the pelvis, genitals, and left leg, if this pattern was ancestral. What came up was the sensation of cold as well as fear that caused his lower body and leg to shake. When he asked an ancestor to emerge, Stephen remarked that he looked male, young, and it looked like he was running from something and completely terrified. Based on the scene he viewed, he had the sense that this may be connected to his Haitian lineage. With a sense of knowing, Stephen felt that this came from the Haitian Revolution and that this man was part of the slave revolt. He had given his life so that his people could be freed. When he realized this, his body began feeling warmer and some of the sensation of wanting to run away lessened. He asked this man what he needed, and he replied that he wanted to be known for what he did. Stephen said he would be proud to honor him, and his body Deva said that he died without being honored. Stephen imagined a good funeral for him with a well-tended gravesite. Stephen visualized a funeral for this man and asked what beliefs were created from the situation. The man had no reply. He then asked his body Deva, and it replied that there was not a specific belief, but a pervasive feeling of being lost or not at home that came about due to this man and his experiences. Stephen related to this feeling and how it had a place in his own life. The scene disappeared, and Stephen returned to his own body, letting the pattern in the pelvis, genitals, and leg know that it was no longer needed to hold this traumatized energy. The energy released quickly, revealing other ancestral patterns for Stephen to work on. Even though there was more to work on in this area, he felt more vibrant and present in his daily life and became interested in his family history. He had not mentioned lower back pain, but said that he no longer experienced back pain or headaches after this ancestral energy resolved. Yeah, so I feel like this just speaks so clearly to everything that you are speaking of today. Just wondering, what happened with Stephen after that? Do you know?
I worked with him a couple times after that. There are a couple of reasons that I chose his case for the book. The first is that it was such a clear case of ancestral healing. I mean, everybody has, varying traumas or micro traumas, kind of growing up, but he really had a good intact home. And so although he had, some personal healing to do, there was this large weight, this large energy that he continually felt, but couldn't really name because it didn't have a place in his personal history. He, didn't particularly in his current life have a reason to feel the way that he necessarily that he did, or to the severity that he did, and certainly not. What was interesting about him was that most of the time he was this incredibly gregarious dude that everybody would love, and then once or twice a week he would erupt in just these rages that were quite, kind of magnificent in a way, but really they were causing him a lot of embarrassment because they weren't kind of part of his nature, as well as were causing rifts in some of his relationships and that sort of thing. And so with the discovery of this ancestral energy, and, he worked with an altar, I think, a little bit, but really what was relevant for him was this concept of the good death. And I talk about this in the past lives chapter a bit, but death is one of those really important initiatic moments. And in certain traditions specifically, if we are not honored, if we're not seen, that's a really intense trauma. And so for him, what that allowed for him to do is to really get an interest in his history and his lineage, and to start to do things like study history, to study where that aspect of his ancestry came from, and to like read about the stories, from the various lineages that he was a part of as well, to sort of incorporate this energy in, and to honor it by kind of, carrying those stories forward, as well as just being kind of informed of, how those energies impacted him. And so I'll say in my work, just as kind of a side note, is that even if we're doing things like ancestral healing, past life healing, cultural, whatever is going on, that I consider it really important for people to look at how the beliefs from the trauma, how those beliefs that were created out of that trauma impact the person today, impact the person now. Because we're still carrying out those beliefs, we're still carrying out those traumas. We've just kind of changed things a bit to fit in our current lives. I kind of compare it in the book to like a snowball rolling downhill. And so I just wanted to mention that as well, which differs from some systems of ancestral or, kind of past life sort of stuff.
Yeah, that there's the somatic trauma, but then there's the narrative and beliefs about it that also live in our bodies that we're also experiencing as a result of those energies being unhealed in previous generations.
Yeah, and we carry them out and we add on to them. We add snow onto that snowball down the hill. If we come into this world with, a huge amount of fear, there are going to be experiences that show us that we have every right to be afraid, that kind of add on to or consolidate those beliefs. And that belief may be very, very real and very, very present, but at the same point, how much, ancestral energy that's unhealed is sort of backing it up and, could be healed to allow for the person to feel a bit more secure, or to not have to carry that sort of intense load of energy.
Yeah, like we get a choice what we do with it, right? If do we resolve it, do we integrate it, or do we attempt to create justice and a good death, or the right things to do? Yeah, I want to talk with you about ancestral healing in general. One of the things, you have a fantastic blog, by the way, and, just want to direct people to maryshutan.com, where you have written, for years about all this stuff. And one of the things that I find so really helpful and refreshing and hopeful, like when I read your blog, and I've spent a time reading it, you're so no bullshit, and you're so really concerned about efficacy, right? And making efficacious use of healing technology. And I know you have a lot of thoughts and opinions on that, and on practitioners who don't necessarily do that, right? I think that it's, ancestral healing is definitely having a moment in the communal consciousness at least in North America right now. And just curious what you would say of what are you looking for? What are you tracking for in terms of ethics of practitioners? Like, how could somebody make a good choice about who to work with? Just anything that you want to say about ethics.
It's kind of a large topic. What I will say is that ancestral healing is definitely, of course, having a moment. I'll kind of start there. What becomes difficult specifically in the West is that we have, the best term I've heard for it is called spiritual orphaning. And so we've become really schismed from spiritual reality. And what tends to happen is that people want to sort of fit into society, or they may be interested in spiritual topics, but what happens when you follow a spiritual path with authenticity is that it's a continual evolution. Like, if I were to talk about higher consciousness states and, kind of, or an experience of infinity or whatever you want to talk about it, what it does is that it really renders a lot of humility to the person. And so one of the things that I teach my students to look for within as well as without is this. We could simply talk about it as ego or arrogance, but is somebody who has had spiritual experiences with authenticity will no longer be participating in what I call the superiority-inferiority loop. They will have this sort of perspective where they understand that people are attracted to specific things for a reason rather than blaming that individual. We all come out of kind of different webs. We all have different reasons for being. Like the quote you started this show with, we all have reasons for what we reach for. And if there isn't compassion for that, that's a huge red flag for me, for anyone. If anybody's spending their time saying that they are awesome because everybody else sucks, we can look out and see how prevalent of an energy that is. And so I would say that that's kind of a big red flag in terms of ethics, because until people reach kind of a certain perspective or way of being, is that they're doing healing work for themselves. And this may include even kind of bypassing or kind of pushing their issues outward onto other people that they should be kind of healing within. The teacher Tenzin Palmo, she says this much more succinctly than I do. Basically, she says that if you're drowning in your own life, that is not the time to teach somebody else how to swim. You should be focused on, getting yourself to shore, so to speak. And so if we were to kind of wrap back around to ethics, what I would say is that in a world that's so spiritually orphaned, people don't really recognize the depth that is involved in how it requires people to really look at things, to really take stock of themselves, to really do their own work in order to be of service to others. And so if you are able to find somebody that is continually evolving, that continually looks at themselves as a beginner, that continually can see the vastness and how little they know, instead of kind of going into false mastery mode or saying that everybody, sucks but them, that would really be somebody that I'd encourage people to see, to seek out, to look for in their practitioners more than any specific modality or even training or anything like that.
Yeah, so really that commitment to one's own personal work, as well as I heard you say the word humility, and that's been something that other folks I've interviewed have really emphasized. Yeah,
because when you have spiritual experiences, when you go beyond the hedge, or, I love that metaphor, but, when you start to interact with the other or spiritual or whatever, natural or whatever you want to talk about with it, when you begin to have experiences of divinity, it's just total kind of vastness, you feel so small, and it's not in like a bad traumatized way. It's like wow, even if I study for, I spent 10 years, a solid decade of my life doing nothing but kind of attending to my spiritual path. And out of that, the more and more I evolve, the less and less that, I'm sure of, the more and more beliefs that I let go of. And so we live in a world that is so thick from trauma and so spiritually orphaned that people latch on to psychological, mental type stuff because it's appropriate. It's sort of within the hedge. But there's that lack of humility there, and it comes from a lack of interface, a lack of, kind of evolution in a way. And so it really can show you where somebody's perspective is and where they are in their own healing path. And somebody's own process is a roadmap to your own. There's kind of a deep energetic connection there, specifically with spiritual and energetic work. And so if you're looking for somebody to do deep work with, they need to have done their own deep work and to kind of get past some of those first initiatory gateways that allow for them to really sit with themselves and wonder, why do I need to tell everybody else they suck? Why do I need to feel in control of knowledge and feel like I know everything, feel like I've mastered everything? What within me needs to feel outer approval or needs to continually prove themselves, because that wastes a lot of energy. And it also shows that there's some personal healing work that needs to be done before really being able to tend to others in depth.
Thank you for that. It's super helpful. And Mary, just really want to offer deep gratitude for your work and for being willing to be interviewed on Bespoken Bones. It's really helpful to have models of people who are living with, this commitment to personal healing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's always lovely to have conversations with people who kind of, similar sort of wavelengths.
Yeah, totally. And I just want to, again, direct folks to your website, which is maryshutan.com, and your book, your new book, your latest book, which is The Body Diva, Working with the Spiritual Consciousness of the Body, which is great. I really recommend it. So thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode of Bespoken Bones. And I'd love to hear how this conversation has landed with you. And you can feel free to be in touch on the bespokenbones.com website. There's a contact form there. I'm Pavini Moray, and I will be back every new and full moon with more embodied wisdom and ancestral goodness.